All right. So I asked everybody what brought you here. That's kind of a classic question in Zen Buddhism. How many have heard the question, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? It's one that comes up over and over in the koans and lots of things. So a question that a lot of teachers will ask in Zen is, where'd you come from? What brought you here? Those kinds of things. So decided to use that as a context to bring us in. But more particularly, I'm calling this the sudden history of Zen. And that will become more clear in a moment. Um, hang on, how does this move forward? There we go. All right. The first slide I have here is I just want to contextualize the history before we go into it. I call this the non-history of Zen history because Buddhism Buddha was born in like the 5th or 6th century, sixth to 5th century BCE, before the Common Era. We're not sure exactly when. At that time in India, in the subcontinent, he was born in Kapilavastu in the northern part of India. And there were the Vedas were a huge part of that religious tradition, which goes back thousands of years. One of the interesting things that came up when the British colonized India was that they found no history in India. In other words, they found no texts that talked about history the way that we do, like, this king took over and there was this battle and what have you. And so it was a really vexing question and still vexes people. In fact, I got my master's degree in theological studies over at the Harvard Divinity School. And one of the professors over there had a whole class on, is there history in India? We could spend much more than 90 minutes on this, but it's interesting because the Vedas are scriptures that, again, are thousands of years old. They are unauthored. They're considered to be unauthored. They're considered to be eternal, as this quote says. And they are applicable to all times and do not contain or refer to any history of mankind or humanity, if you want to use that. I took this from a quote in a Vedic website. So it's interesting to think about that. The Vedas are meant to be eternal. And so when the British were trying to piece together history, they were combing the Vedas, and there's a lot of Vedas, and it's a lot of language. There's no real historical reference points to kings or battles or eras or anything. And so it was very difficult to see, okay, what's going on? And if you look a little bit about Buddhist history, because we're going to start with Buddha so that we can figure out how did Buddhism become Zen, which is fascinating, is Buddhism didn't consider itself to be born from the Vedas or from the Brahmanic faith tradition or Hinduism. There's no concept of, well, in the West, we would talk about the history and we will say the Buddhism was a natural outbirth of the meditation practices that were happening in Jainism or the Hindu religion and such. But Buddha would claim that there's an eternal Dharma and that sprung, it was realized, and there's nothing that sprung from anything else. Buddha just was able to see it, realize it, and share it. So it's interesting to think about that as we move into some of the Zen history, and to think about how that works with the practice that we have when we say, oh, you don't have to sit, you're already enlightened, or we have these insights where suddenly everything makes sense. So in a sense, talking about Zen history is kind of weird. The other thing that's interesting is that in China, the traditional calendar is cyclical. And there's, in fact, when Westerners went to China, a lot of times the missionaries the Catholic missionaries would ask, what is your creation story? Because in Christianity and in the Abrahamic faiths, how the world was created is like an important question. And there is a God who created it, and there's Genesis, and there's all these things. So they would ask them, what's your creation myth? And the Chinese didn't quite know how to answer that. Now, you can look up Chinese creation myths and you'll find them on Wikipedia, but they kind of evolved over time because they needed to just have some way to answer. And in some in the open court and some other later publications in the 19th and 20th century, there were these debates. They were interreligious publications. There were debates between Christians and Eastern faiths about, okay, how did things begin? And then the Eastern, I think it was one of the people we talk about, Soen Shaku, who is the first Zen priest who came to America. And we'll talk about that later. He was like, the one argument by this Christian minister was that a train has a caboose and an engine. It has a beginning and an end. So what is your beginning and what is your end? What is your creation and what is your apocalypse? And Soyen Shaku said, yeah, well, what comes after the caboose? What came before the Big Bang? So when we think about history, there's a different sense of what we mean by history. So I just want to contextualize that. And from a Western perspective, we love history. It's part of us, but it's in a lot of ways the way we look at time and history from a Western perspective is very different from the East. In fact, my Indian studies professor in graduate school, when she wrote about, or she passed away actually a few years ago, when she said that she would write about the history of India, she didn't use history. She would talk about things in time. She would talk about temporal things. This happened then. This happened. It wouldn't be the history of it. This is the temporal moment. This is what happened. So with that context, I want to give you one other context. John McCrae is an academic of Zen studies, and he has 4 rules that I think are helpful as we begin to think about Zen and Zen history. His first rule is that it's not true, and therefore it's more important. And one example of that, how many have heard of the sixth ancestor? Sixth ancestor, Huineng, or the sixth patriarch. So the sixth patriarch there's a platform sutra about it. It's the only sutra that we know was written in China for the Chinese, and specifically, and Huineng is one of the most important characters in all of Zen Buddhism. And there's a whole platform sutra about him. There's a whole biography and all that stuff. And everything we basically know about Huineng is not true. The only thing we know is that there was a monk named Huineng that lived at about the time that they said this Huineng. But everything else is probably not true at all, and therefore it's more important, and we're going to talk about that. The second thing is that lineage assertions are as wrong as they are strong. We often hear about lineage. So Bodhidharma came from, Buddha passed on, this transmission of the Dharma to Mahakashyapa. And later, Bodhidharma passed it on to Hui Ke, who passed it on to Seng Kan, who's the third patriarch or ancestor. Seng Kan passed it on to the fourth, who was Dao Xin. Dao Xin passed it on to Hongren, who is the fifth. And Hongren passed it on to Huineng. The stronger the assertion is about something like Hongren passing on to Huineng, probably didn't happen. But it's very important in terms of how Zen operates. So it's interesting. Precision implies inaccuracy. That's very similar to the Huineng story. We have a lot of details about Huineng's life, and they're pretty much all inaccurate. And whenever there's romanticism about something, there's a cynical aspect of it. Just want to contextualize that most of what I'm going to tell you is both true and not true, and it kind of doesn't matter. And that's why I go back to the sudden history of Zen, because there's this wild interaction between what actually happens, what doesn't happen, what is the truth, and how we got here. Have I thoroughly confused everybody? I hope so. All right, let's go here. All right. So now I'm going to get into more of a kind of Western sense of the history of Zen. And but with that context in mind, I'll be pulling things out and sharing some different aspects of it. But broadly speaking, many of you probably know this transition. Buddhism happened in northern, or Buddha was born in northern India. You can see there in the northern India. I don't know if you can see it well enough, but there's Kapilavastu. That's where Buddha was born. It's right near Kushinagara where Buddha died. So this little, I'm colorblind. So the darkest part there is where Buddha was enlightened, where he taught, where he was born, and where he died. And so from there, Buddha thrived there for a while, and then through a series of invasions in India, northern India, Buddhism expanded out from there. And then for a long time, there was no Buddhism in that area. There was the Mughal invasion. There were lots of other things, and Buddhism spread elsewhere, but was not there. In terms of our Zen history, I'm not going to go, so you can see a lot of the arrows going down into Southeast Asia. That's known as the Theravadan, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What we're mostly concerned with is as it moved into China and Japan and America, this was the Mahayana, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But roughly speaking, this is how Zen moved from India to America, and there's a history there as well. Who knows what the term Zen means? You can share with us that. Anybody? Denise, from your reading?
Pretty much kind of what I've kind of taken from it.
Whoop, you just went on mute again.
Sorry. It's kind of just like that stillness.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of like what I've interpreted a lot of from it.
Yep, great. So in India, the term meditation is jhana, the Sanskrit. The Sanskrit term is jhana. In China, the name meditation got transliterated as Chan, C-H-A-N. And when Chan moved from China to Japan, Japan transliterated it as Zen. And so the word Zen means meditation. And that's why we often call Zen the meditation school of Buddhism. It's a lot of it is centered on meditation. So. Oh, what's that? Okay. So let's go back to India. So, hello, Roger. Yay. We can see you. So back in India, Buddha, as I mentioned, was born in Kapilavastu, which is in the Magadha area of northern India. It was called Magadha at that time. He was born into a noble family. Many of you probably know this. And then his father, when he was born, it was determined by one of the wise ones in the court that he would either become a great king or a great religious leader. And his father, the king, did not want him to become a great religious leader. So he kept him in the palace and made sure that he loved everything in the palace. He became the best food, the best experiences, but wouldn't let him go out and see all the poverty outside of the castle. But at a certain point, Shakyamuni Buddha, Buddha became his honorific. Buddha just means the awakened one. It comes from the same root word in English as bud, like a bud to be awakened. Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, so there are some roots that can speak to us. So Buddha, he wanted to go and see the world, and so he was led out a few times and began to see that there was suffering, there was illness, there was death, there was aging, and it disturbed him, and he needed to figure out what was going on. And then he broke away from the palace, and then through a series of his journeys, he found some other holy people, and then eventually meditated and found his way to the Four Noble Truths, which are: there is suffering in the world. That was the first thing he saw, was that there is suffering in the world, that people could age and die, things that he was sheltered from in the palace. So there is suffering, and we can't escape it. And the second noble truth is, of course, that there is a root to suffering, and those the main root is delusion or ignorance. There are, in some ways, three roots, the three poisons: desire, wanting things, wanting more than what I have; or anger, which is not wanting things; and ignorance, which is just this delusion. So it's all based on the fact that in this, we want things to be other than they are. And he said that there is a way out. That was the third noble truth. And then the fourth noble truth was the Eightfold Path, which is right view, right thought, and it goes through. So that became the basis for his teachings. And this was called the first turning of the wheel. It's Theravadan, the way of the elders. And this was the predominant form of Buddhism in the early centuries, 6th to 5th, and then 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st centuries. The main texts are the Tripitaka, which just means three baskets, like cycle. It's the same root we have for triple three. It's three baskets: the sutras, the Vinaya, which is the rules of the Sangha, how the Sangha lives together, and the Abhidhamma, which is more of a deeper philosophical text about the teachings of the Sutta. This is not Zen yet. All right, there we go. So now we get to India around the 1st century BCE, and something begins to arise called the Mahayana. We don't know a whole lot about what caused the rise of the Mahayana, but there were teachings that began to expound in a different way about the Eightfold Path. A lot of the early teachings are very much about ethics and sitting in meditation, and it's in a lot of ways feels kind of straightforward to us. In the Mahayana, particularly one of the main proponents of the Madhyamika, which is a key aspect of Mahayana, was Nagarjuna, who was a Buddhist philosopher who taught at the University of Nalanda. And they began to kind of dissect or turn upside down a lot of the teachings of the Eightfold Path, to say, and if any of you have chanted the Heart Sutra, how many people have, I mean, pretty much we've all probably at one point or another the Heart Sutra. So you'll hear no seeing, no hearing, no smelling, no so they're basically negating the teachings of Buddha, because Buddha's original teachings is that there were 5 what they were called kleshas, or heaps. And the Mahayana began to say, okay, yeah, there's seeing, hearing, smelling. Well, these are the 6 senses. So it goes through those. There's the 12 conditioned circle of life. From as soon as you are born, you will die, and there's cause and effect. And the Mahayana said, yeah, there is seeing, but there's also not seeing. Began to kind of turn things upside down in weird ways. And so it was still Buddhism, but it began to take it to a different level. When we talk about emptiness, when we talk about no self, a lot of this becomes part of the Mahayana. So this is called the second turning of the wheel, which is about thinking about the Buddhist teachings in a whole different way. And the Mahayana means the great vehicle. And a lot of authors who wrote about the Mahayana at that time wrote in opposition to what they called the Hinayana, which is the Theravadan way, the Buddhist teachings that we know. And Hinayana just means the little way. So it's kind of pejorative. So we try not to use that anymore. We talk about the Theravadan and the Mahayana. And this happened again in Magadha, Gandhara, northern India, before Buddhism left that area. Some of the main texts are the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Lotus Sutra. Many of us know the Lotus Sutra, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, of which the Heart Sutra is one of them. And when India begins to change and Buddhism begins to leave that area, it's Mahayana Buddhism that begins to move into China, into Tibet, into other areas. And so Zen is based in these sutras. And so I have this picture on the left here. This is an illustration from the Avatamsaka Sutra. The Avatamsaka, I should have brought it. It's big, it's huge. I've got it, and it's like thin paper. I've got a copy of it over there. I'm a nerd, so I've read the whole thing. But in these things, there are like these Buddhas that, create Buddhas upon Buddhas and have congregations of bodhisattvas. And there's lots of huge visualizations of universes and Buddha lands and Buddha fields. And so it's a whole different aspect of what do we mean by reality? What happens when we sit? And I'm not going to go into too much, but this becomes the Mahayana, which again moves out from India. So that was India. So we got this Buddhism, we've got this Mahayana thing that's starting to have this kind of philosophical twist to the original teachings. And so that's what makes its way into China. So in China, the legend has it that the first person to bring, or the first person to bring Buddhism into China was Bodhidharma. Not necessarily Buddhism. There were other people who brought Buddhism over, but Bodhidharma is the one that Zen considers to have brought over the real teachings and a real lineage. And we're going to talk about lineage in a little bit. Lineage was not a huge thing in India. You don't talk about being transmitted from one to the other. It became important in China. Part of the reason for it was that in China, in order to get a foothold in China, Buddhism had to adapt to some of the cultural norms. And in China, Confucianism in particular had a huge hold on the psyche of the Chinese. And in Confucianism, family is very, very important. And so to have these celibate monks coming in who had no family was in some ways considered to be a disruption to the true order of things. And so lineage began to create a sense of family. It began to create a sense of, like, emperors had lineage as well. So you could have lineage outside of bloodlines, but actually they were bloodlines. When Zen priests later would write their lineage, they would write it with their own blood. And monastic communities in many ways were regulated very much like families in China. And so Bodhidharma, coming as considered the first ancestor to China, was a later invention, probably didn't happen. There wasn't a sense of Bodhidharma being anybody, really. He probably existed, but to be a first ancestor, you don't hear any talk of that. I don't know exactly when, probably till the 4th or 5th century. So again, this is one of those areas where there's a lot of talk about Bodhidharma. Why did Bodhidharma come from the West? You'll have lots of histories of Bodhidharma. Because there's so much written about Bodhidharma, most of it's untrue, inaccurate. It's one of those paradoxes of Zen. Part of the Zen history is that it's a collective history. And so when future Zen Buddhist communities were looking for histories to help them solidify themselves, they looked back and they began to find names of people that had very little history around them. So it was much easier for them to create a narrative that helped them support their own community. So rather than take the names, actually, many of the first Buddhists who came to China were translators. Translators were actually the most revered Buddhists early on in China. People really revered the texts. They were trying to get the texts from India translated. And so a lot of the learning about Buddhism was based on the texts. It was only a later innovation to begin to put the teacher first. And that began to make it more Chinese. Just like when in early Christianity in the West, as it began to take hold in the Roman Empire, there would be persecutions. There were also persecutions regularly of Buddhists now and then. And so the Buddhists there began to have to figure out how they would, make their way into this Chinese culture with some of that back and forth. And one of the biggest things was that this was a foreign religion. And so the translations were just translations of something from a foreign religion. So the more foreign it seemed, the more the Chinese could rebel against it. And so that's why we eventually have the Platform Sutra, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it's a purely Chinese sutra. And it's the only sutra that's considered part of the kind of core canon, although even that's kind of weird. I won't get into the details of that. But so anyway, Bodhidharma's first ancestor purportedly came into China around the 5th century. He was Mahayana. We call it Proto-Chan. His big text was the Lankavatara Sutra, which is one of the Mahayana sutras, and he mostly taught with that, or the other monks around him at that time taught with that. So now we move into the 7th and 8th century in China, into the Tang Dynasty. And this is where, let me go to the people here. Hui Ke is the second ancestor. He received Dharma transmission according to the legend. Whether or not he did or not, again, the stronger the lineage relation is, the weaker it probably was in actuality. So Bodhidharma passed Dharma transmission to Hui Ke to Sengkan, the third patriarch or ancestor, Sengkan to the fourth, Daoxuan to Hongren, which is the fifth. And I'll talk about Huineng in the next slide, which went from the 5th to the 6th ancestor, because Huineng is a pivotal character in Zen history. But what's interesting here, and why I have Empress Wu here, first of all, Empress Wu was the only female emperor of China. She consolidated power after her husband passed away. And a lot of the reason why she was able to consolidate power was that she used a lot of Buddhism to justify her role on the throne. And so her reign was a pivotal place in terms of solidifying Buddhism as a Chinese faith tradition that had adherents in the court. And so we see here, this is interesting, this is a Buddhist statue of Empress Wu in one of the temples. So we talk about the fact that there are very few women mentioned in Buddhist history. This is one that we don't necessarily talk about because Empress Wu was not part of a lineage per se, but she was very important, in fact, probably key to Buddhism making a foothold in China, and particularly Zen Buddhism, which in the Tang Dynasty was beginning to take shape. The other interesting thing that I'm going to point out about Empress Wu is that she did not call herself an empress. She said, "I'm an emperor." There's no male or female or gender in terms of being the ruler of the land. So I find that interesting as well. At this point, and these people who were teaching Huike, Senkan, we do know that Dao Xin existed. He had a big following. Hongren had a huge following and was a very successful teacher. We don't know much about Senkan or if he even existed. Huike probably existed, but Hongren on East Mountain had a thriving community, and it was from that community that many other monks got Dharma transmission. Many of them made their way into the into the capital, into the court. And so after Hongren passed away, so at this point in the 4th and 5th centuries, they began to create this lineage. Okay, so this was one way that they really got the foothold in among the Confucians. They began to adapt Confucianism and Taoism into Buddhism. And so having the, in fact, yeah, let me do this first and then I'll go back. I'm going to skip ahead here because I'm talking now about how the lineage came about. The lineage that we know today and that's chanted in many Buddhist temples, Zen Buddhist temples, was solidified during the Song dynasty in primarily in the Jingda record of the transmission of the lamp. There were several transmission of the lamp, and you'll see lots of different histories. In fact, some of them, Bodhidharma is not the first ancestor. There's other people, or it skips certain others. But it's finally in this, and in many of the early transmissions of the lamp just means the Dharma, essentially. It's a metaphor for the Dharma. So the Chinese Buddhists created a transmission all the way from Buddha through 26 teachers, and then the 26th passed it on to a Bodhidharma, and then they had the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th ancestors. And so this transmission lamp has all the stories, the biographies of these people. A lot of it's hagiography, kind of saintly worship stuff, but it tells us a lot about what was important to the Chinese Buddhists at the time and how they made their way into the court. Song Dynasty solidified this, but it was in the 4th and 5th century that the Zen priests in China began to think about how to create order out of this. And a huge part of this, and this is some of the ways that Zen Buddhists began to have power. Because if you're being persecuted, you have to figure out how you're going to get your way in the court. And so they have this special transmission outside of the scriptures, not dependent on words and speech. And so having this family tradition and having this mysterious way that can only be transmitted began to hold this power. And so emperors began to treat this with some more respect. Particularly a lot of the more dynamic and charismatic Zen teachers had followings. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the court, the emperor and the priests, how the emperor could regulate people using Buddhism and how Buddhism could use the emperor to propagate Buddhism. Very similar to any sort of religious tradition. You find that in Christianity and other areas. But this is the way that the Zen Buddhists began to do it in China. So let me go back now. So after Hongren, there was a clear 6th ancestor who was Shen Jiu. But we never hear about Shen Jiu. Why? Because Shen Jiu was in the capital. He was well known. He was known as the 6th ancestor, the 6th patriarch. But there was another monk who was not in that lineage. who was extremely charismatic named Heze Shenhui. And he had huge gatherings of crowds, and he was able to actually convert lots of monks into monasteries. And this was wonderful at the time because when you became a monk, you had to pay the court fees for your documents. And so the court loved this guy because he was bringing in lots of wonderful funds. Um, and so in order to make himself and his ancestors give them more clout, he said this guy Shen Qiu is not the right sixth ancestor. The real one is Hui Neng. And so he did this whole thing about Hui Neng, and he created this whole dispute that there's this gradual enlightenment versus sudden enlightenment, which is kind of a whole ruse, but in the popular imagination, it took hold. And I won't go into all the details about it. It's really fascinating. But he basically won. And one of the things that he did, he was very good marketer. And he really pushed the idea of sudden enlightenment. And every school of Chan believed in sudden enlightenment. There was no real argument there. You won't find a huge distinction between the teachings of a lot of the teachers. But he made a distinction that made it possible for him to move forward. But what he did was he forced every teacher to have a stronger rhetoric of sudden enlightenment. So some of it would get loose around the edges, like the silent illumination, like I'm just going to sit here. You can just sit there and you can go crazy, right? That's not enlightenment. And every teacher knew that, but he said, you've got to put wisdom and sitting together, and that enlightenment is always accessible, and we need to change our rhetoric to ensure that that happens. And so he's not one of the ancestors. We don't talk about him. There's no koans about him. There's no whatever. Like, he got left out in the cold. But he changed the course of Zen history by talking about this Hui Neng, who we have a couple of names of Hui Neng as a student of Hongren, the fifth patriarch. He probably came from a noble family. He probably was like every other monk there and sat and was fine. He didn't really have a following after that, so much so that nothing was written about him. But Shen Hui created this whole myth about this illiterate woodcutter who was wandering around South China and heard somebody chanting the Diamond Sutra and was suddenly enlightened, and asked the person who was chanting it, who I believe was a woman. Somebody can probably women enlighten more Zen masters than they're given credit for, and they're all nameless, but I'm pretty sure it was a woman. And he asked her about it, and she said, well, if you want to know more, go to this monastery, which was Hongren's monastery. And so he created, Shen Hui created this whole myth about, he was an illiterate woodcutter. He went in there. He was working in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for years. And then when they were looking for a successor, the person who everybody thought would be the successor, there was a test, and this highest potential successor wrote this poem, and everyone was like, oh, that's awesome. And even Hongren was like, good. But the Hui Neng, the illiterate, went and asked somebody to read the poem to him, and Hui Neng said, please write mine up there, and he wrote it next to it, and he basically won the contest. But Hongren said he won, but Hongren said, look, nobody's going to accept you because you're this illiterate monk. Here's Dharma transmission, here's the robe, here's the bowl, but leave immediately because everybody's going to be after you, etc. So it's this whole story about why we don't know anything about Hui Neng, right? So Shen Hui's like, he's a literate woodcutter who nobody would accept, and he's got the real teachings because it's from the earth, etc., etc. So that's how we get Hui Neng, who is actually a person. Okay, so this is very likely his corpse. This is his mummy. This is Huineng. It's still at the temple where he's at. I forget where the temple is, where he died. And you can go and see his mummy. It's kind of creepy. And he sits there in the temple. And this is the sixth ancestor. And if you read the Platform Sutra, you'll hear that whole myth, but it's probably, it's all made up for the most part. And so Huineng became the sixth ancestor. And from Huineng, we can trace all of the lineage of all the teachers that Zen has had since then. Let me pause, because now we're going to move. Well, actually, let me get to Japan, and then I'll pause for questions. So after Huineng, there's several other lineage. But then the lineages begin to branch out. There's 5 schools, there's 6 schools, there's the Oxhead school, there's whatever. One of the key figures is Matsu, who I think is 2 generations lineage from Matsu. Matsu was the one who began to preach about ordinary mind, and you'll see Matsu in a lot of koans. The koans, these dialogues that we talk about, somebody asked Cho, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Cho says moo. Those come from what were called encounter dialogues, that were supposedly dialogues that teachers had, mostly in the Tang dynasty. So Matsu was one of those that we have these kind of dialogues. Now, those dialogues are mostly made up. They're mostly put on to these folks from the past, but there's some truth to them. Matsu was a very popular Zen teacher. People from all over came to study with him, and so he became his sermons were actually cited a lot of sutras, and later Zen would kind of dismiss the sutras, but he talked about ordinary mind, and that became the basis by which Zen began to move toward, okay, we can talk about all this abstract scriptures and these Buddha lands and Buddha fields, but what does this mean for us here now? A very kind of Chinese Confucian way. Confucianism is very practical in a lot of ways. I mean, there's spiritual aspects, philosophical aspects. But he began to let's find in the sutras, yeah, this is ordinary mind, is Buddha mind. Like, what does it mean when we say everyone is a Buddha, or is everyone enlightened? He said, well, it's here now. And so from that, we begin to get these other teachers. Lin Chi, let's see, yeah. Lin Chi, who we often know as Rinzai. We know Cho, the Chao and Dong, who were the 2 teachers who created the Xiaodong Soto, which became Soto Zen. Lin Chi was known as Rinzai, that became Rinzai Zen. There were other schools. And then we have a transmission of the lamp. And by the Song dynasty, all this becomes solidified. So now a lot of the collective history of Zen then begins to impose a history on the past to claim its rightful place in China, in the court, in the minds of the people, in their monastic traditions, and we have a fully mature Zen. Now, at this point, and here we also get the koan collection. So all these dialogues, so in the transmission of the lamp, there's a lot of stories. You'll get some of Matsu's sermons, you'll get, a lot of these dialogues, some are made up, some are not, but a lot of those longer biographies with some parts where there's a dialogue back and forth become encounter dialogues, and those encounter dialogues become pithier things that we call koans, which in Chinese was gong'an, which means a case, a court case. So it's like in law school, you study cases, case law. or at Harvard Business School, you study cases. And so these were cases that adherents of Zen Buddhism would study in order to learn from the masters before about how to realize enlightenment. So this is, then we start to get these snippets of dialogues, the koan collections, Muman Khan, Gateless Gate, Blue Cliff Record. This is Xiaochan, Song Dynasty. This is a picture of Nanchuan, who many of us know, the violent one about killing the cat when the monks were arguing about a cat, and Nanchuan came in and held up the cat and said, "If anyone can say a word, I will save the cat." And nobody said a word. They were all like a deer in the headlights. And so he cut the cat in half. This is one of those pithy dialogues that we sit with koan, and then we try to work through with a teacher. So Japan. So in Japan, what happened, there were some early folks who brought over Buddhism. I don't have, I can't remember, even one brought over some Zen, but none of that really took hold. Some of it took a little hold. Where Zen really began to capture the imagination was with Dogen Zenji. Most of us may know Dogen Zenji from the Shobogenzo, the Treasury of the Dharma Eye. At the Greater Boston Zen Center, we had lots of sessions where we would read parts of it in a group and we would comment on it. You'll see lots of parts of the Shobogenzo in our sutra book. Genjo Koan is one of the famous ones. Fukanza Zengi, that's the instructions on meditation, is also part of the Shobogenzo. Dogen went to China to learn Zen firsthand, and he went during the Song dynasty. And remember I told you in the Song dynasty around the 11th century, and then it was the 11th and 12th century, things got really solidified. There were the koan collections, there's the lineage, they're in the capital. There's actually two capitals. They moved capitals because of an invasion. There's a persecution. But then everything gets kind of set. And of course, what happens when things get set? They begin to demise. So Dogen happens to go at like the pinnacle of like, they have everything together, and he's very excited because there's some Buddhism happening in Japan, but he goes back and he discovers this really fascinating approach to Zen, and he brings it back. And he is part of the Soto school. His teacher was Ru Jing in China, and he brings the whole lineage chart. He has his lineage chart with him, and he sets up shop in the woods. So part of the romantic history of Zen Buddhism is, this, woodcutter going off in the woods. And he did not set up in the capital of Japan, and set up a real powerful community there at Weiji. And then, so there's that, but then there was also, and he influenced some of the other Zen, my Japanese Zen history used to be much stronger. I've been really focused on the Chinese because I was like, how did this get to be this way? In Japan, you still find the same sort of practice in terms of Zen monasteries. They basically take a lot of the same Chinese. They take the koan collections, and the koan collections are in the Chinese calligraphy. And so the Chinese calligraphy becomes part of the whole tradition of the koan collections. And we begin to see, because Chinese calligraphy is used in Japan, it often means the same, but is pronounced differently. We begin to see, you notice that in a lot of koans, these enlightenment experiences happen kind of in the open. There's the congregation is assembled and the teacher says this and asks this, and then one of the students gets up in front of everybody. And so a lot of the interaction happens in public. In Japan, it becomes between the teacher and the student in a in more of a private room because you're trying to dissect some of the Chinese characters, which are more difficult in the larger context. And this becomes particularly poignant when we transfer Zen to America, because the first people who came over were Japanese, and their English wasn't always so good. And to talk about these, and there was also a sense then in Japan that there was much more of a secrecy around the actual solutions to the koans. And so we start to get the secret transmission even more in Japan. It does set up shop in one of the things that I love about Japan is that when Buddhism first came to Japan, the emperor wasn't sure what to do with it. So he sent some folks to the great shrine at Ise, the Shinto shrine that Ise, because Shinto is more of an animist faith tradition like Taoism, or more of a Native American tradition, or Wiccan, that there are spirits in everything and nature and such. And so he sent a bunch of folks to the great shrines of Shinto at Ise and said, what am I supposed to do with this Buddha person? And the gods of Ise said, don't worry about it. We're all one. So they accepted the religion. There were no fights. There was, I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? Side note, when the Jesuits came to Japan in the 1600s, the Japanese were like, oh, sure, whatever, and the Jesuits, like, if you want to talk about your religion, great. But then the Jesuits began to teach that, Christianity was the only religion that you had to adhere to, God and Jesus. One of my favorite anecdotes was Matteo Ricci, who was one of the Jesuits who went to Japan. He wrote back to the Portuguese, his Portuguese seniors about what he saw in Zen Buddhist Japanese monasteries. And you see this in scriptures and scrolls and stories and whatever. In those monasteries, he said, male monks were having sex with other male monks. And he said, not only were they having sex with each other, like this abomination, but he wrote, they have no idea that it's an abomination. Like they had no idea, like why would they think that men having sex with men is a bad thing? So he had to explain to them that this was a sin and that this was hell. In Japan, in the whole sexual history of Japan is also interesting. There was not a whole lot of discrepancy between it was not homosexual or heterosexual. It was just sexual relations. In fact, it was more about who was receiving and who was giving than anything else. But I just find it interesting. So then when the Christians began to propagate, the Jesuits in particular began to propagate Christianity, they began to say it's the one true God, and they became a problem. And that's when the Japanese kicked the Jesuits out. Because the Japanese are fine with any religion as long as you don't try to make your religion superior and say that everyone else is wrong. That's a little side history, but it pertains to Zen Buddhism. So in Japan, Buddhism takes strong hold in the court. Nara, in the ancient capital, if you go to Nara, which I've been to, it's the deer park. You'll hear a lot about deer parks in Buddhism. In the ancient suttas, Buddha is often at Deer Park. Anathapindika, who was one of the wealthy sponsors of Buddha, they would go to the deer park there, and there's big deer all over Nara, and there's the huge Buddha in I can't remember the name of it, but there's in the old capital, Buddhism is all over the place. And then they moved to Kyoto, and if you've ever been to Kyoto, Kyoto is lined with Buddhist monasteries all around the hills around Kyoto. And part of Zen history is that in China, there became known as 5 mountains. There were 5 different schools, and they were known as the 5 mountains. And in Japan, they replicated that with like 5 mountains. And then there was kind of a six, but they wanted to have 5 mountains, 5 schools, 5 primary schools of Zen in Japan. So Japan began to kind of replicate it. But what happened is it had a revival in Japan. So Japan began to take the Buddhism from the song and really um, bring new energy to it. Dogen in particular with the Shobogenzo and the focus on sitting. And that's why we're known as Soto is the sitting school. So we sit, and again, they would get the Soto Zen school, and even now today kind of gets accused of sitting on a log and the silent illumination, all that stuff that Shen Hui railed against, that you have to have sudden enlightenment. It's not just sitting in this gradual, but in Soto, it's gradual. And there's this misperception in a sense that Rinzai is much more focused on the koans than Soto. The truth is that koan study is very important in both traditions. What we mean by an emphasis on it or not can mean different things based on different lineages. What I'm showing you here is Hakuin, who was Rinzai Zen. So Soto Zen really took hold in Japan from the 13th century to the 15th or 16th century, primarily because of Dogen's influence, but there was a lot of Rinzai Zen as well. And Hakuin was a Rinzai Zen teacher in the 18th century who revitalized Rinzai, particularly through, and this is where I think we get a lot of the misperceptions about koan study, particularly because he focused a lot on koans. He began to introduce koan practice much more into Zen practice, even though it was part of the Soto Zen practice. And he came up with the koan of what's the sound of one hand. And he came with other koans to begin to bring it into the Japanese context. And that's one of the things I'm fascinated about in America is how do we begin to bring American or Western koans, because there's ways to do this. So Hakuin also propagated this idea, which goes way back to the Tang era, of cultivating doubt. Huge part of koan is to frustrate the discursive mind and to create a sense of doubt so that we can move into new areas of knowing. And Hakuin worked with the samurai. The samurai loved Zen because there was such a discipline to it. And actually, part of the history of Zen is through this discipline and the relationship with the samurai, which actually Zen liked because then it was welcome in the samurai court. And so they had power. But this idea of discipline and samurai and war actually led to, when we get into World War II and the Japanese imperialism, a lot of the Zen teachers and priests were nationalists at that point. And so we get Zen talking about, well, ultimately, nobody dies, so it's okay to kill in war. And so it was this kind of politicization. Not that Zen has not been politicized, and it was a lot in China as well, but that link between power and any religion can become problematic. But when Hakuin actually propagated this idea of the great doubt and revitalized the Rinzai, it actually had a powerful effect on the whole religious practice in Soto Zen in Japan. And that is the Zen that began to peak in Japan. Okay, so now we've got Hakuin, we've got Shobogenzo, we've got Zen firmly ensconced in Kyoto, in the 5 temples, and then the capital move from Kyoto to what's now Tokyo was Edo. And then during the Edo period, we have a court that is firmly Zen Buddhist and Shinto, but becomes more Shinto for various reasons. there was a nationalist push and there was a push back against the Buddhists. And then after the Edo period, we began to relax that. And then Zen priests begin to align themselves more with the Shinto and the nationalists in order to keep power. And that's a whole other history in itself. There's a couple of really good books on that. But what happens is now it's 18th century, 19th century, Zen is peaking in Japan, and so it comes to America. And the first Zen teacher that comes to America is Soen Shaku at the Parliament of the World's Religions, which was the Columbia Exposition, the World's Fair of Chicago of 1893. And they brought faith traditions from all over the world. There have been few times in world history when you have all the major faiths together. This was one of them. There was another time in the 1600s in the court of King Babar in India. There was another time in the 1200s in Genghis Khan had Buddhists and Muslim. I mean, we think, we're this connected world, now, and that this never happened. But Genghis Khan brought Buddhists and Christians, and they had debates, and Babar's court also had these. Well, America had its moment in 1893. And Soen Shaku was the Zen Buddhist who came. They also had Swami Vivekananda, who became a splash sensation in America. He's seated there kind of in the middle next to Soen Shaku. And this is when we get our first Zen master, and we begin to have, I'm part of the Parliament of the World's Religions. Their mission was to bring all these world religions together to hear from them, so that people could understand that Christianity was the pinnacle of all religions, and these others were on their way to it. And when a missive got back to Japan about this was the underlying mission, the whole Japanese delegation threatened to not come at all. And then the head of the organization, sent them, who was very much open to, it was not that kind of, Christianity first, sent a nice letter and convinced them to come. So now you begin to see people beginning to take interest in Zen. And one of the other characters that I think is really interesting, she gets lost in the history, but it's a woman. She was the first foreigner to become a Zen priest in a Japanese Rinzai temple, Ruth Fuller Sasaki. She ran a publishing company that published a lot of early translations and such. She was apparently a real autocratic business leader. And so when she fired one of their chief writers, I mean, it's a name that you would know, and I can't remember who it was, but after that, like a whole bunch of them just resigned en masse because she was such a tyrant. But she was and she's written some really amazing stuff, and she's an important person in the transmission of Zen to America. Part of the transmission to Zen to America was, and we've been talking a lot about this Greater Boston Zen Center, is more sexual scandals. For the first time, these Zen Buddhist priests would come and they would be working with women for the first time. Because, so one of the biggest scandals early on in the 1980s was Shunryu Suzuki was one of the Japanese Zen masters who was not implicated in any scandal that I'm aware of, but his main student, Richard Baker, was. And so Shoes Outside the Door became one of the first big exposés about this issue. And we see it over and over in America about scandals of many types, but primarily sex scandals. And this is part of the things that we're trying to work through with Zen on American soil. I bring up White Plum Sangha. Maizumi is the Zen lineage ancestor of many of the teachers who have taught at Greater Boston Zen Center. He was a self-professed alcoholic, womanizer as well. White Plum Sangha is very active in America today. And so we're still trying to work through a lot of how Zen lands here. And this is where I bring us right up to date to Boston, where we're dealing with the similar issue. And then let's take it to the world, because there's Zen going all over the world. And, many people probably know Thich Nhat Hanh in France. I haven't even really gone over the world stuff that's happening. He died a couple of years ago, but there's lots of teacher sanghas from Plum Village that don't necessarily have teachers leading them, and they're Zen. And so there's some possibilities around how do we work through this lineage abuse in the world today, and then we bring it back to you. The place is now, the time is now, the place is here. There's no history. This is the sudden history of Zen, and so this is it.